On the issue of labor, we must address our departure from the National Tripartite Advisory Council, NTAC. The labor movement has always been a strong advocate for the process of social dialogue, as we believe that it is critically important for economic growth and development, labor productivity, and social order. It has been 5 years since the formation of NTAC, and in that entire time, the country has not seen the development of a single policy which has made any significant impact on the economic progress of the country, nor the establishment of a stable industrial relations environment. This PNM government continues to unilaterally take decisions which affects workers, from the shutdown of the Tourism Development Company in 2017 to FITUN in 2018. This was done under the guise of restructuring and resulting in massive job losses, social and economic fallout, and once again with the desired outcome of eradicating both trade unions and the collective agreements. Then there were also massive retrenchment at TSTT, UTT, and other state enterprises, with further threats to Lake Asphalt, effectively weakening representation of workers at those state enterprises. None of these were discussed at NTAC. The government is of the belief that they now have a template for getting rid of trade unions and collective agreements at state enterprises. It is the same approach and narrative that they use for the TDC and FITUN they are now using for NTAC and WASA and the port. Watch out for that. Even whilst the trade unions were participating in NTAC, the government consistently pursued its anti-worker agenda without consultation. For example, the disrespectful Minister of Public Utilities publicly announced their intention to restructure NTAC, TSTT, TT Post, and Swimcol, again without any consultation with the unions. Apart from being disrespectful, his ultimate intention is to reduce the workforce, plunging more people onto the breadline. Another example of disrespect for trade unions is the public pronouncement by the Minister of Finance concerning terms and conditions completely violating the collective bargaining process. The Minister of Finance has openly refused to honor existing agreements for NIB, port, and sanitation workers. Furthermore, can you imagine, after 5.5 years in government, not one piece of labor legislation was brought to the Parliament? There's an urgent need for immediate changes to labor legislation which gives workers priority in any liquidation process. Therefore, appropriate amendments to the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act and the Companies Act are urgently needed. Urgent changes are also needed to be made to the registration, recognition, and certification process. This would allow for workers to exercise their rights to join a trade union of their choice. Far too many workers are denied trade union representation because of the current long and difficult recognition process. There is also need for urgent amendment to the Industrial Relations Act to allow the Industrial Court powers of enforceability of its judgment, and also to guarantee tenure of service for judges. Although the labor movement have been preaching these and many other issues on behalf of workers for the last 5 years, we have received no support at the level of NTAC. Whilst the population continue to suffer under this government's failing economic policies, with thousands of workers have been retrenched, with more to go, and with the demonizing of workers, disrespect for workers and their trade unions, increased prices and increased cost of living, attack on old age pension, significant increase in penalties for minor offenses, increase to the cost of fuel, plans to increase LPG, and plans to increase electricity and water rates. All of these measures are placing a heavy burden on the majority of our citizens who are buckling under pressure and who are faced with extreme hardship daily. Regardless of how government ministers try to spin it, or criticizing us for leaving, and even shamelessly claiming that the process was working, with all these issues and injustices against our people, the trade union movement could not simply continue to sit in a process where it was ordinary working people and the poor carrying this massive burden of economic adjustment. We could not take it anymore, and therefore, without apology, we had to depart NTAC.
Good day, Trinidad and Tobago. I am Ozzi Warwick, General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement and Chief Education and Research Officer of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. You would have just heard another excerpt from the Labor Day feature address delivered by the President of the Joint Trade Union Movement, Comrade Ansel Roger. And of course, that address would have dealt with a wide range of issues, but a major issue that Comrade Roger dealt with would have been the trade union's departure from the National Tripartite Advisory Council. Well, we have with us Comrade Joseph Remy. He is the president of one of the federations that left. That is the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs. And let me also just say that he's been recently appointed to the World Council of Credit Unions. Is that correct, Comrade Remy?
Yes, that's correct, Comrade Ozzi.
Let me just first of all publicly congratulate you on behalf of the entire labor movement on that appointment. You've always been one of those strong advocates for the two people's organizations to work closely together. So you are the embodiment of both movements.
Thanks much, do appreciate, man. It's all in the interest of the working class.
Excellent. Comrade Remy, well, you would have heard the excerpt from Comrade Roger highlighting really, or rather providing an explanation to Trinidad and Tobago as to why the three federations had to leave the National Tripartite Advisory Council. So I want to hear from your point of view in terms of Comrade Roger's explanation, to put a little color on it, but also to say that you were a member, you were a sitting member of that council, and therefore would have had a lot of insights in terms of some of the shenanigans by the government representatives in that council. So would you say, listening to the excerpt from Comrade Roger, that he was right on point with regards to why the trade union movement had to leave the National Tripartite Advisory Council?
Comrade Ozzi, I would want to endorse in totality the comments made by Comrade Roger on Labor Day, because he captured the gist of why we left, and he was accurate in his articulation on the rationale that the federations utilize for exiting the National Tripartite Advisory Council. Because we were clear in our minds that it was just another political charade that the government was engaged in to demonstrate to their party supporters, you know, the cult, as Morgan Job used to say, that we are doing something for social dialogue. But it was not a genuine effort at social dialogue, as we know, as enunciated by the International Labour Organization. And if you could recall, when we resigned from the Tripartite Advisory Council, we made it abundantly clear that we were resigning not because we didn't get our way, it's because we were not satisfied that the government was given enough credence and importance to what social dialogue really means in its true sense. And we felt that the NTAC was just another arm of government trying to postulate government policies through us to say it would have been approved by the labor movement and the employer class. And we saw through that charade, and we felt we were not going to be used for political expediency on behalf of the current government.
One of the things that he highlighted, and we'll get into some of the specifics, because I think it's very important for Trinidad and Tobago to appreciate what the trade union movement would have had to be going through, trying to be part of that process, understanding our role in terms of social dialogue, but really being part of a process which was, according to Comrade Roger, disrespectful in terms of the treatment to the treatment of the labor movement by, in particular, the government officials?
Definitely, and we found on several occasions that we did not have a quorum. And not having a quorum does not mean there were not sufficient members from the working class representation, nor from the employer class. Ironically, on all occasions, on if not all, 99% of the occasions that the meetings were not held was because of the absence of a quorum from the government. And there were several instances, Ozzi, and I could attest to it, that I had to chair the NTAC in the absence of the chair because of the fact that the subsisting chairman was absent for one reason or the other. There were some valid reasons offered for on the basis of health, but then there were instances where there were not sufficient government representatives to give a good leadership to the process. So we were very clear on a lot of occasions as to the rationale, and we felt that a lot of times some of the government representatives were not paying the kind of importance that NTAC supposed to have. They were not giving it that kind of importance. In particular, the Minister of Finance, you know, he never attended a regular NTAC meeting, and he was only present when summoned to do so to give an explanation on particular issues. And we always would say that is a critical ministry when it comes to the National Tripartite Advisory process. And as such, his presence would have been critical in resolving a lot of the issues that would have been raised at NTAC by both the employer class and the workers' representatives. And we felt that that was a form of disrespect by the government for not treating it the way it ought to be treated. And we had no choice but to exit because we felt that there should be a genuine effort made to give NATOC the kind of recognition that it deserves based on the fanfare that the Prime Minister used to set up NATOC. You could remember the big fanfare at the Prime Minister's residence when they installed the officers of NTAC. It was all over the press and the media that this was something that the government was engaging in out of some genuine concerns. But their action did not support the fanfare that was demonstrated on that day.
You know, a process like this will always require some level of leadership. Not that you want any one partner to be superior to others, but really to facilitate the discussions, to show a level of seriousness. And I believe the NTAC chair wouldn't that have been Minister Camille Robinson Regis?
Yeah, she was the Minister of Planning and Development Minister. She was designated as the chair of NTAC.
Exactly. So, I mean, her absence, I think, it does send a certain type of message that
that's right.
That NTAC is not important.
That's right. And not only her absence, there were times some other critical ministers were absent. And when we had to engage in discussions that centered around the work of their ministry, we could not have afforded to engage in those discussions because of their absence. And it really undermined what the legitimacy of the process ought to have been.
Right. So you have this mechanism that is put in place, and I'm happy that you reminded us it was put in place with great fanfare.
That's right.
It was a huge launch.
Definitely.
But then when it comes to the functionality of this mechanism, in other words, to bring about concrete outcomes that can alleviate some of the pain and suffering that citizens were going through in the context of the economic situation, it just didn't function.
No, it did not. It did not. And there were, to me, what had to happen and what we were disappointed in NTAC was the construct. What happened is that we would engage in discussions and we were reminded that at the end of the day, NTAC had to report to the cabinet. So once NTAC had an obligation to report to the cabinet, thereafter, any decision that comes out of NTAC will now have to go to cabinet for cabinet scrutiny. The whole bureaucracy would be in step in, and then cabinet don't necessarily have to agree on any one of NTAC recommendations. And we felt that that is definitely not what we understood the process of social dialogue to be. It should be a process that allows partners to come from an equal perspective, to bring issues from a national perspective onto the table, discuss them, and then push them forward for implementation. But if we are considered an arm of cabinet, then by extension, we are just another arm of government, touting government policies and practices. And we felt that was a disrespect to what the process of tripartism is about, as outlined by the International Labour Organization. And we felt we could not have subscribed to something like that when the whole modality was not in keeping with what's supposed to have happened in the first instance.
And I think there was this major contradiction, and we'll get into that, which had to do with the fact that a lot of things were actually happening. Government
Definitely.
they were making decisions.
Major decisions.
Major decisions. So you have a mechanism that's supposed to contribute to decision making, but
That's
then
right.
it's not functioning. And then you have the government making major decisions that are having major impact on ordinary working people. And so therefore that was a contradiction. So can you somehow explain why would the Minister of Public Utilities say that the unions were being disingenuous about the departure from NTAC?
And I believe
if that could be explained.
Well, I can't explain his rationale. What I could say is that his rationale was nonsensical. I consider, because of his neophyte status and wanting to demonstrate that he is a new kid in town and he come to make a difference, that he jump in the fray without understanding and appreciating all the efforts that were made by the trade union movement and by the employer class to have NTAC operate in a manner that we believe would have added value to the national developmental process of Trinidad and Tobago. And we believe the Minister of Public Utilities was totally disingenuous in his articulation. He was out of place because he had no knowledge of the challenges and the trials that we had to undergo to get NTAC to where it is. And let me give an example. In the onset of NTAC, one of the first issues we discussed, and I could remember, we had a meeting with the then head of Petrochin, Mr. Fitzroy Harewood. And we had a discussion on the fact that Petrochin was critical to the economic development of Trinidad and Tobago, and how could we as NTAC put out some policy perspectives and prescriptions that will allow Petrochin to be profitable going forward. And one of the things he highlighted was the aging infrastructure and all the other things that would have given rise to Petrochin running into some challenges. And we said we would agree for NTAC to engage in further discussions on the way forward for Petrochin. Lo and behold, the government took decisions about Petrochin, the closure of the refinery, without any further interactions at NTAC on that particular issue. And that has been a major and a disastrous decision with major consequences for the social and economic fortunes of Trinidad and Tobago. And there was no discussions at NTAC on the issue of the closure of the Petrochin refinery. Absolutely none.
Well, very interesting that you raise that from the NTAC perspective, and I don't think members of the population, of the public, were aware that even at the level of NTAC, there would have been an attempt to really address the issues
of
with
Petrochin.
Petrochin.
That's right.
And therefore, it really continues to beg the question: who gave the advice to close Petrochin? Up to now, that has never been answered.
It is shrouded in mystery.
Can you, another major issue I think that would have been raised on Labor Day platform that would have made it things very uncomfortable for the unions at NTAC would have been the question of mass retrenchments?
Yeah, and again, we would have had an input in trying to generate some discussions around the issue of how the whole issue of retrenchments. And we, on several occasions, we had attempted to get from the Minister of Labor accurate data on what was happening with respect to retrenchments. And what we discovered, the loophole that was being used by employers was the fact that you only had an obligation to report retrenchment, which was over five and above. And all those retrenchments, and they did it in a very subtle and very, discreet manner. That they were, if they have to lay off 25 persons, they will do the process 5 times or 6 times. So that they will do 4, and then they will do 4, and they will do 4 on several occasions to get away from having to report those things to the Minister of Labor. And what you found happening was that the minister was not aware. And then the issue of the retrenchment at TSTT and all the other organizations that we raised. And we said, look, we believe that there is a different way these things could be done. We have some state enterprises that we believe that we should engage in discussions in terms of how do we fix the governance structure and alleviate from those state enterprises the issue of political interference and manipulation that would have allowed those state enterprises to degenerate to the point where good governance and management is not present. And those discussions were not held. We have not had any opportunity to have discussions on anyone of those state enterprises to bring about to us a collective view on how we could restructure those enterprises. One, to eradicate the political manipulation that was taking place that put some of those enterprises into the mess that they are in, and to give it a good governance model that will allow those state enterprises to serve the purpose that they were supposed to serve, which is to represent the interests of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So those discussions were never held, and we started discussions on some of the labor legislations, and it ran into the whole bureaucracy within the government. The Industrial Relations Act, the Workmen Compensations Act, they were stalled at the cabinet level in terms of the recommendations that were made. And we even engage in discussions on how do we treat with compensating workers, like in the metal situation, where we look at things like an insurance that will cover workers in the event that they have to be retrenched. And how do we bring a soft landing to some of those workers to allow them to have some easy transition from being in one company that may had to close on the basis of economic circumstances, and transition from unemployment into another form of employment thereafter. And that unemployment insurance discussion started and never materialized to any substantive conclusion. And those are the things that we felt that would have been critically important, because if the economy is going through some challenges, and there has to be some agreement on the disruption of workers' employment, and I don't want to use the word retrenchment, I'm saying disruption temporarily, then we should provide some level of relief to those workers during that transition period to allow them to move from being employed through the unemployed state and then to end back up into sustainable and viable employment. And we felt that those things were not taking place at NTAC at all.
I want to raise up three other additional issues, and I'm wondering whether these were at all addressed by NTAC. But there are things that will have such a massive impact on the population. I'm talking about the liberalization of fuel distribution, privatization of the port, the restructuring of some of the key state enterprises, including WASA, TNTEC. There's some talk about some manpower audit. I mean, were any of those issues addressed in a real and substantial way at NTAC? Because that is why NTAC would have been created in the first place.
And let me say emphatically, no. There were no discussions on the reorganizations of those organizations. Those things were happening outside of the realm of NTAC. And we felt that that was a disrespect, because we were seeing major decisions being taken that was having some seismic impact on the economy and on the way how work is done, and on employers and on employees' livelihood. And we were not seeing any effort to have these things discussed at NTAC. And when we raised them, we were not given any kind of traction, any kind of consideration. And we continue from the labor movement to push for those things to be raised, and it never materialized. Look at the current situation with the NIB and the issue of the retirement age. Those things were never brought to the table at NTAC to have any meaningful discussion on, but these decisions are being made in the public domain. A pronouncement are being made in the public domain in the absence of any discussion at NTAC to give some kind of thought process to the whole issues and have divergent views, let them contend and come around with some solution. Those things never happen, comrades.
Also, I recall, and I think this part is important because, persons have these sort of misconceptions of trade unions, that the labor movement very early on under the PNM administration, would have been about 2016 or so, would have presented an economic plan. Is that not correct? Or what became of that?
Well, that was tabled at NTAC. That's the only thing we could say. It was tabled at NTAC. And we don't believe that any in-depth analysis was done on our presentation. It was never the subject of an in-depth workshop or any discourse at NTAC to that extent. They extrapolated what they feel would have been necessary, and they put it into a framework that was going to be used going forward. And it died a natural death eventually. It was never given the due consideration based on the efforts that I knew was put into the development of that document, because I worked with you, comrades, in terms of the labor input into the development of that document. And it was some detailed analysis that was done to reach to that point that we reached, and we felt that we were moving in a different direction. You know, there's always the view that Labour opposes, but don't bring solutions.
Yes.
But this time around, we opposed that we brought a solution to the table.
That's correct.
But it was never given consideration.
All right. Well, as we sort of wrap this interview up, and I think there's so much more that that you can share and that I think is important for Trinidad and Tobago to hear. One of the things that struck me coming out of the Labor Day feature address had to do with something Comrade Roger said around this NTAC issue, where he said that the trade union movement could not simply continue to sit in a process where it was only ordinary working people and the poor carrying this massive burden of economic adjustment. I think from where you sit, you are, you're also former Secretary General of the Communication Workers Union, so you are a well-known trade unionist, and you've been around for a long time, and you're also a credit unionist, right? So you really sit in a very unique place. What would be your view on ordinary working people carrying the burden of economic adjustment? Was that a fair conclusion by Comrade?
Definitely. I would totally agree with it, Ozzi, because I see it from all walks, and you're right. Straddling across the board people-centered movement, you would understand the challenges. And at the credit union level, you were seeing the struggles workers had to undergo to readjust their financial and economic circumstances on the basis of the adjustments that were pushed down their throat by the administration. You find in some instances, some workers were forced into delinquency at credit unions, and that is a reality. And they had to come back and do a lot of reorganization of their loan situation because the capital base was now eroded, because in the absence of permanent work, your savings have been depleted, your capital base, there's no income, steady income, sustainable income coming in. And what you found is that it was impacted on the people's organization also. And that is, he was right that the working class was carrying the burden of adjustment, and you were not seeing any attempt being made to bring down, the earnings at the higher end. I have always been one to articulate that the gap between the executives and the ordinary worker is too wide in a society that is crying out for equity and justice. And we need to look at CEOs' pay and MPs' pay and make a correlation with what happens at the lower end to ensure that there is internal equity and external equity in terms of compensation across the board. And we are saying, and I have done some analysis, you have instances where in the TSCT case, our CEO at a time was earning $300,000 per month, which would have been 10 and 15 times one of your senior engineers who would have been carrying the burden of the development and doing all the planning and design of the TSCT network. But your CEO was earning 15 times that. And we felt that that was totally inequitable and unjust. And those are the kind of adjustments that we believe were not being made, because instead of reducing CEO's pay, you were finding that they were giving perks and bonuses at the end of the year, and they were giving increases, while the workers had to be forced. They were tying a string around their belly when there was no other flesh to tie it on again. And we felt that that was unfair, and I am in total agreement with what Comrade Rosa said on Labor Day with respect to the workers having to carry the adjustment. And we could not have sat in an environment like that where everything was being shoved down our throats. It was going to be, to me, a real contradiction for us to sit there and accept those kind of things.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Remy, for agreeing to this interview. And really, I want to publicly thank you and the other leaders who would have really taken a stand for ordinary working people, and to really show that, listen, there are people in this country who are willing to stand up against injustice and will be willing to do what is necessary in order to protect and defend the interests of ordinary working people. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, Comrade Ozzi, and I will continue, the struggle continues, so I will continue to do what I have to do.
As they say in South Africa, la luta continua.
Continua, that's right, great.
Thank you, Comrade Remy.